Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senior Managing Director of JLL Capital Markets, Mrs. Mindy Berman.
Oh, thank you very much. The voice of God speaking. Well, welcome to the last show. Thank you for attending this morning, and we have a terrific panel of great professionals doing interesting deals. So we're going to kick off with introducing the panelists here. I'm really pleased with the fact that we've got two founding partners of Revista. I just realized that, between HTA and Welltower, an advisory board member from the health system side, and a distinguished institutional investor. So we're going to go down the line here and let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the content.
Okay, well, I'm Kyle O'Connor with MLL. We're a value-add investor in the medical office space, although we will invest in life science or laboratory properties as well.
I'm Scott Seelig with Duke University and Duke University Health, and I handle the real estate for the university and the health system out of Durham, North Carolina.
Good morning, Robert Milligan. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Healthcare Trust of America.
Good morning, I'm Russ Simon. I'm Vice President of Investments at Welltower. I lead the majority of our medical office underwriting.
Great. So today we're going to go through 4 case studies of transactions, 3 cases of acquisitions, 1 case of a seller, and interesting cases. So these are significant deals of the year. We've selected them because they have some interesting lessons learned in them, and they exemplify many of the trends that we're experiencing today in the growth of outpatient care. So we're going to use these case studies to illustrate these points. We'll let each of the panelists present their cases, and then do some Q&A amongst the panelists. I'm going to direct some questions. I hope each of you will redirect to each other if you find interesting points. Yep. And then if time permitting, we'll let the audience engage as well. So first up is going to be Scott Seelig.
And I have 2 slides and no little clicker, so hopefully somebody's got the little clicker. I've been sitting in this chair for 18 years now, working for the university and the health system. Duke University Health System is smaller relative to some of the other ones you've heard. We have 3 hospital systems, about 25,000 employees, because we're a major academic research facility with really 2, if you will, community hospitals adjoined to that academic research medical center. We're in Durham, North Carolina. The whole triangle's about 1.2 million. In Durham, we're about 300 to 400,000 people. So it's a relatively small market to some of your markets. The facility that we developed and then sold was 125,000 square feet. This was a deal that, when it happened, when we finally sold it, I crowed about it for about 60 or 90 days, so proud of how much money we'd made and making all this money for our doctors group and that kind of thing. And then Mindy asked me sort of to talk about this, and the more I thought about it, the more things we did wrong with it. And so I'll go through real quick. If you'll just go to this, you can read it's 125, for those that can't see it, 125,000 square foot building. Relatively well located, but it is a classic 125,000 square foot outbuilding. No ASC in it, but a number of multi-specialty clinics. You want to go ahead and click over to the next page. The whole concept behind this is we are about 10 miles south of our major hospital, and our other community hospital is in North Durham. So this was going to be a major play for us from an MOB standpoint. The plan when I started, and this is one of the key points, the plan when I started was we lease in building 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The idea was those were between 10 and 40,000 square foot leases, as you can see on the right-hand side. The idea was, well, why don't we just consolidate them and build something and own something and put it right at the main intersection, because they're all single floor buildings, and we could get better presence, newer facility designed for our needs. That was the concept that I went in and just quietly put a 12-acre site under contract and went to the, you have to realize we have a health system, which is nonprofit, and a private doctors group of about 2,000 doctors or so that is for-profit. I initially took it to the health system and said, we need to build a large facility. I put this property under contract. And they said, we don't really want to make that decision because it takes capital planning. It's not on the capital plan. It's classic large organization. Don't bring me something I haven't thought about. I went to the PDC, which is a for-profit private doctors group run by a very small group of people, and I said, there's an opportunity here to move, and they said, sure, we'll take it. And so closed on the property. We started out with a 100,000 square foot building. At the very last meeting, I said, look, we have a need for 100,000 square feet. Let's put 125,000 square feet because in every facility, we've taken more space. And they finally went, yeah, and they did it because it made it prettier. Right? The building got taller and architecturally it looked better. And so we did 125,000 square feet. We got the building built, filled it up with all Duke, and didn't move any one of those locations into that building. They were all planned for that building and didn't move any one of it. As a matter of fact, we bought location number 7, the largest building. Right? And this was really the lesson learned. What I didn't think about was I solved the problem for the day. I solved the problem that everybody could see. I didn't solve the problem for what it should have been. So we built the building and a parking deck next to it and have built all of those, and have not renewed all of them, but renewed or are going to reuse most of those current facilities. But now, because of the way we laid the building out, I've sort of limited the use of what is the good 7 acres of the 12 acres that I bought. So now if you drive down I-40 about 4 miles, we have now constructed another 200,000 square foot building, including an ASC. I didn't project the growth. We made good money on this facility, but I did not project the growth. And so my lesson to you, how many of you are working deals with health systems in some sort of process? Just show of hands, right? When was the last time you said, has the plan changed from when we started? And should it change from when we started? I understand we have a building designed, but is it changed? Because everybody could have been better off if we would have done that. And I'll stop there for right now.
Terrific, very interesting. We're going to move now to Russ Simon, and I'm going to pass the baton to you.
No pressure.
Learn that lesson.
Thanks. All right. Hi, everyone. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this portfolio, I suspect a number of those in the room are quite familiar with it, but I'll start by just giving a quick overview of the key statistics. It was a national portfolio, 55 buildings, 3.3 million square feet, located across 16 states. Welltower acquired the portfolio for $1.25 billion, which equates to a purchase price in the high 300s per square foot and is generally in line with how we were viewing the replacement cost for the portfolio. Other metrics are what you'd expect for an institutional quality portfolio. 94% occupied, 2.4% average rent increasers, 92% affiliated with top health systems, roughly a 50-50 mixture between on-campus assets subject to ground leases and half off-campus fee simple assets. Mostly about 3/4 triple net leases, some modified gross in the balance, average building size of around 60,000 square feet, all pretty much down the middle for what I'd say we typically see. A few of the interesting aspects of the portfolio with the basics out of the way. First is just kind of the logistics of closing a portfolio of this size, especially with a number of multi-tenant buildings. There's well over 200 tenants in the portfolio. We had roughly a 50-day diligence period, which spanned December 2018 and January 2019. So it's a great holiday. Made a lot of points with my family, but we got it done. Not to cut to the chase. I think, obviously, given the holidays, but even without the holidays, over that period, 50 days is a pretty tight period for a portfolio of this size. And I think that's illustrative and consistent with broader trends that we're seeing in the portfolio or across healthcare real estate. We've been talking as this conference has gone on about the increased demand for healthcare real estate, and obviously that has direct pricing ramifications, but sellers are increasingly driving, because of the demand, shorter diligence periods and earlier diligence starts. So I'll also say that does help the buyers a little bit. We talked a little bit yesterday on one of the panels. Ted Flagg at JLL mentioned the volatility that was in the markets at the time this portfolio was being marketed. So that volatility was very much top of mind on our capital markets team. They wanted to get this transaction closed as quickly as possible in order to fund it and lock in our cost of capital. So it ended up being a sort of mutual desire to close as quickly and efficiently as possible. Going back to the diligence process, there's a few attributes of the Welltower platform that I think allowed us to close on an efficient manner. The first is we relied on Welltower's data analytics platform to underwrite a few aspects of the portfolio. One item that we utilized our data analytic capabilities was to underwrite the hospital risk. For the affiliated portion of the portfolio, we used a proprietary kind of risk scoring to get a sense of the financial viability of the sponsor health systems, which, stating the obvious, critically important, and do so in a consistent manner across the portfolio. We also used our team's capabilities to underwrite the market rent using a mixture of local demographics, local supply, using data from places like Revista, and the specifics for this building's attributes. And we correlated that with Welltower's existing portfolio to develop an independent view of market rents. Obviously, though, it's still a very hands-on business that requires on-site diligence. You can't underwrite this asset class from the desktop. So we relied heavily on Welltower's got a local property management team that's actually headquartered just up the road in Jupiter, Florida. That team covered basically the country. Show the portfolio map here to give us market color across the country and give us coverage for on-site diligence and tenant interviews. With these tools, we were able to waive diligence on time and then transfer the focus to the ground lease ROFR consent process. I think there is another attribute that we're seeing health systems becoming increasingly sophisticated with their ROFR rights. They're not just looking at it as a binary, are we going to exercise, are we not going to exercise? It's a trigger for them to reassess all aspects of their outpatient real estate strategy as it relates to that building. We had one health system that was particularly illustrative of this point. The health system approached us during the ROFR process and said, after ground leases were put in place 20 years ago, after markets changed, and said the ground leases and the space leases didn't provide them the flexibility that they were looking for with respect to relocating the suites within the building. They were often having growing practices. They needed to play a game of musical chairs, move one suite, one place, and they didn't want to have to come to our attention. So we were able to negotiate a way to allow them flexibility within the buildings while protecting Welltower. They also wanted additional control over things like the property manager or operating expense increases. Welltower heard these asks. They were all pretty reasonable. From our perspective, we wanted to protect our shareholders and extend ground lease terms, secure additional leasing commitments, and then also for the controls that we gave with respect to relocating suites and property manager selection to be tied to the health system's occupancy in the building. We were completely okay with giving them those controls, but that was predicated on continued support of the building. The goals, actually, we were fortunate that they aligned very well. We were able to execute documents that went into escrow and sprung into place at closing. It was a win-win transaction. Actually led to, we did a follow-up acquisition with that health system just a couple months after we closed, which is a great sign that the proactive working together approach led to future business, which I think is what we all look to when we invest, to have it be a partnership approach and grow from that. The rest of the closing process for this transaction took a while. 200 plus tenants, a lot of tenant estoppels, but went pretty smoothly. We closed in second quarter of 2019, and I think sitting back about 6 months later, everybody's pretty happy with how things ended up. With that, I think I'm handing it over to Kyle.
Great, thank you. Well, obviously a much smaller portfolio, but there's probably some similarities in the challenges that we face. But I'll walk you through enough about the portfolio so you can understand it a little bit. But this portfolio closed in December of 2019. It was approximately $140 million transaction overall. There was 9 buildings, 469,000 square feet. What made the offering a little bit different than some that were in the market in 2019 was about 41% of the assets would be characterized as value add. Some of you probably got the offering memorandum on this one, and if you dug into it, you pretty quickly realized that there was going to be a pretty big forthcoming occupancy drop that was happening on January 1st of 2020. And so that limited the number of folks that were interested. I think it's probably fair to say that there was a bigger amount of interest in the core and core plus asset portfolio, and less of an asset, or less of a portfolio buyer interest in the value add assets. For the seller here, which is a very large investment manager that has multiple funds, they created this portfolio by pulling assets from a variety of funds. And so for them, having one buyer, one transaction was of paramount importance. But they also had to achieve pricing on an allocated basis for each individual asset for transparency and fair value reasons that was fairly important to them. And I'll talk about one of the challenges of that in a minute. But the portfolio spanned 4 states, as you can see, with a few major markets and some, health systems that you all may know. And if I can work the slide correctly, we'll give you a little more breakdown of it. Here are the individual buildings and the assets, but 60%-ish on campus or campus adjacent, 40% off campus, mostly multi-tenant. And the tenancy was a split between investment grade health system and a variety of other practices. The third-party physician practices are broken down for you further. As you can see, it's a very diverse portfolio, not necessarily heavily weighted to any particular specialty or line of clinical care. Again, a mixture of on and off campuses, locations. All of the on-campus properties had ground leases, and all of those had the similar issues that were just being addressed. The buildings were a mixture of age, quality, vintage. This particular image that you're seeing here shows a 10th asset, which was left behind and is still owned by the seller, but all other 9 properties that you see on the screen here were acquired at the time of closing. One of the challenges that's thematically similar here is, and I think it's an accurate statement to say, that the health systems are becoming much more thoughtful about what they're doing with respect to the ROFOs, and consent process that they go through. And I think in some cases they're being a little bit more opportunistic about an opportunity to change things, because they know the transaction is a wonderful way to bring about some change. That change may be very welcome to the new ownership coming in. And it's, a timely moment to bring it up. And so all of those issues were in play throughout the portfolio. What you really understand as a buyer of on-campus medical office buildings is the group that may have been the development partner for the health system has varying degrees of representation for how they're negotiating that ground lease. They have varying degrees of sophistication for the health system that they're dealing with and their internal team. So as a result, the ground leases are all very different. Some of them look like they might have been written in crayon, and some of them were written very sophisticatedly. And, you know, a very lengthy, very well-drafted agreement isn't always better for a buyer. You know, there was a situation where we had a ground lessor who not only had approval rights and right of first refusals and right of first offers and whatnot, but they could also approve things such as not only the loan documents themselves, the security collateral, and that created a whole host of challenges. We were fortunate here that we had a great lender that could work through all of that, but it's a very challenging thing, and as many of you know who are owners of those types of buildings, the service provider industry, the JLLs, the et cetera of the world have done a very good job not only educating their clients, but representing their clients. So depending on the personalities that you're dealing with, you know, additional, you know, tensions and issues can arise from there. Another challenge that was a little bit unique and which made the approach that we brought to the table we think successful here is that the seller felt very strongly about having one buyer. They only wanted to have one purchase and sale agreement. They felt strongly that the allocated values that they had in their purchase and sale agreement needed to be applied. Unfortunately, that was a challenge, it appears, for a lot of people. And how we solved that challenge was by creating, in effect, a cooperative partnership. Us and a group that we had have some existing joint venture investments with went into the transaction as one unified group, but we understood that we were going to split the portfolio in the percentages that you saw between the value add and the core plus. Each of us wanted something out of this transaction, and we think a pretty important element of that transaction was we also had a relationship with the seller. We're existing joint vendor partners in another deal, and so, you know, a little bit of a unified goal of relationships was able to be bridged for all involved. Of course, there were times where it felt like a WWE cage match where people were getting thrown out of the ring and dragged in and all that, but that's ultimately, I think as you were mentioning as well, there becomes a point in time where the goal for everybody becomes, let's get this closed, and the adversarial part of any transaction drops away and the collaborative part of the transaction kicks forward. Consistent with that, one of the things that we had to agree to as the unified buyer was that when we were non-refundable, we were in an all or nothing situation. The seller was really sensitive to kick-out rights. They did not allow any of that. We had an additional layer that at any point in time, one of the health systems could have exercised on the ground lease its right of first offer or right of first refusal, and depending on which building that occurred on, that could have effectively killed the entire deal. So we had to all be in a situation where the two buyers were effectively backstopping each other. And for our partner, who's a large investment fund, that was a little easier for them to do than us as an entrepreneurial group who was buying value-add properties at a lower basis. But nonetheless, it was what was required because the seller effectively wanted to be in a situation where they had a very large deposit, that was up once we were non-refundable, and as they were working through the estoppels, consents, and SNDAs, et cetera, they would have the assurance that that group was going to close. So each of us had to effectively pledge to close over the other one, so we had a third agreement between the two buyers to effectuate that and get some contractual rights. So yes, there's a question that Mindy's going to ask at some point about that, I'm sure. But we also had to structure a deal where we had two loans closing simultaneously. In the end, we had one lender that was issuing two separate loans to two borrowers. But we had a dynamic which we felt there would be additional risk is if we split that portfolio up and we had one lender for each, who knows if the closing would be coordinated as well. So that was fairly important. Capital One was the lender for both portfolios, and they were really fantastic to work through with this. But, look, an issue hanging over the value-add portfolio was a very large occupancy drop that was expected to occur. Those of you who may have looked at the portfolio probably figured it out pretty quickly that it was written in stone, it was going to occur. In that case, the tenancy had already vacated. We had a tail period of revenue that was occurring. Many people who looked at it probably did the same thing we did, we just underwrote that we were buying a 62% lease portfolio. But that creates in itself its own unique set of challenges, as many of you can appreciate. The number of folks that buy value-add, medical office buildings maybe are not as great as the number of people who would buy other types of properties. So, bringing that ability to really navigate that process and all that goes with it. And honestly, back to the ROFO point, one thing that, we were concerned about, which turned out not to occur, but we were really concerned about one of the assets that we really liked was being acquired at a point where the health system might say, well, that's a good real estate play. It's on our campus. We're using the real estate. We might as well buy it back and effectively create an investment opportunity for themselves at, our basis. We were fortunate that they were they had bigger issues that they were dealing with at that time, but that was, from our standpoint, we felt a very significant risk that we were undertaking because we had effectively committed ourselves to doing the due diligence across the entire portfolio with the belief that if it ever came to pass that we had to step up and protect our deposit and buy the entire thing, we needed to be prepared to do that. We had to structure our equity to allow that to occur, which wasn't easy. And we had to be in a situation where, recognizing that one of the very interesting assets on the value add side had this risk where, from real estate people perspective, we thought, ooh, this could be a dynamic where they would look at this and say, that's a pretty good basis. Let's make a real estate play out of it and pull it out and take a lot of the profit that we saw in that portfolio away from us. With that, I will hand it back to Robert.
All right, that's kind of tough to follow with how complicated that was. You must have had really good counsel on this transaction. Ours is a little bit more straightforward. It's a single asset purchase that we made earlier this year. It's a interesting building. It's a 3rd Street Medical Center in downtown Los Angeles. This is one that's 147,000 square feet, 5 stories. We bought it 90% occupied, $85 million, 5.25% cap rate, which we thought was a steal because we heard Scott crowing about the cap rate he got. So we felt pretty good about our ability to transact at that level. Like I said, it did close in June of 2019. So why we found this was interesting as a deal had less to do with the actual kind of these bullet points. Great tenancy, kind of everything else that you typically look at. But what was interesting was this is in an area of LA that is undergoing significant amount of change. So when we look at demographics, I know we spent a lot of time at the conference talking about demographics and trends and where patients are going. We're really looking at broader population and just broader real estate trends as well for how we can locate acquisitions that we're looking to make. I don't know how to go backwards on this, so I'm going to skip ahead and kind of show you a picture of where this sits. This sits clearly in right within downtown LA. It's kind of right between Koreatown and Westlake. And if you had gone there 10 years ago, in fact, when we brought this up to some of our investment committee people that had been in LA and the left, basically looked at it and said, oh, you don't want to go there. This is not the best area of town. In fact, it's right next to a hospital that we underwrote the hospital. We said we would want nothing to do with that hospital. Good news was none of the tenants were related to that hospital, even though it's directly across the street. So that kind of brought in some interesting dynamics at play. But what we found interesting about this whole area was just the renaissance that downtown LA was having. When you look at the Revista data, and there's a reason I'm not going to show you the specific demographic area, it's heavily Medicaid focused right now. It's much lower on the income scale as of today. But where you look at it going over the next 10 years is you see a population, and you walk the property, as Russ said, you can't really underwrite it on the desktop, but when you go and look, you see condos going up all over the place. You see the average age of the population in this submarket going down on average 10, 15.
And the building works. The issue is we don't know who our partner is going to be next week, next month, next year. And when you started these ground leases, there was there were fewer transactions happening all the time of selling these investments. And so now we might rotate that investment, or the owners might rotate that investment 3 or 4 times depending on which portfolio they want to put it in. And every time you do that, they want to reset everything from CAMREX to what you can do in the building. And we don't, like your comment, we don't, one of you said, reset every time that transactions. These are marriages for a period of time. Problem is, you get toward the end of the marriage, everybody might want to change that a little bit. The rules may want to change a little bit, but you've got this prenuptial agreement that states what's going to happen. And as I hadn't really, you scared me a little bit. I hadn't really thought about, no, seriously, I hadn't really thought about, what if we don't need that much health care in this building and we need something else to happen? I have no idea if in that ground lease, we're going to need, somebody mentioned a WeWork, right?
Yeah.
Can we do that? So ground leases are tough. They're really nice the first 10 or 15 years, and then they get really complicated. So, and it's frustrating because we'll just get set with the property management and ownership and those kinds of things, and then we have to redo estoppels, SNDAs, and you guys all want to give me 48 hours to do that. At 4 million square feet, 300 leases, lots of people transacting stuff, and there's 2 of us, 2 professionals in my office and 2 support staff, right? Just not enough time. And so that's very complicated for a health system to deal with in those things. And now I got to think about, what if it's not medical in 10 years or 15?
Well, you mentioned when the ground leases were entered into, nobody really foresaw how often assets would trade hands. They also often don't fully contemplate portfolio sales when it comes to the ROFR process. I think every buyer and seller kind of does their best to conform a portfolio sale to whatever the ROFO rights are of a ground lessor, but it's not straightforward, not terribly well defined, and probably be in everybody's interest when they're entering into new ground leases to contemplate that this is institutional asset class that's in all likelihood going to trade in portfolios.
Right. And what's our assigned value of that portfolio transaction? And maybe I want to negotiate that.
You don't like the allocations we give you?
Yeah. Or that I can buy the whole portfolio is my other option, right? They are complicated, and so you're going to, I think, see people do fewer of them as this velocity of transactions and the number of players and the type of players changes. It's nice because the types of players are getting more sophisticated, but they're actually so much more sophisticated than the health systems or the doctors groups that I think you're going to see a lot of fear come into that over time.
Yeah, I think as we've seen, so much depends on, the documents are all over the place. I'd agree with that. I think we get a lot with Ron and Crayon.
I love
Crayon. By the developer, frankly, that just said, fill in hospital, whatever you want to fill in, and we're going to build a building. But I think for us, it now becomes, who is the next person going to be? Because we could cut a deal, and we know the intent of it and what it is, and you're going to be reasonable because you have this goal, and 10 years from now, 20 years, because you're going to be there forever. Maybe 30, I don't know. But whenever that next person is, they might have a completely different philosophy, and that investment, and frankly, our willingness to invest in the building might change as a result of that. Sure. So we're interested, and we're exploring different ways to get that same kind of control that we understand is needed with some adaptability that could allow for people to grow, us to grow, the health system to grow, and just kind of understand that changing dynamic. But we always put a 3 cap on your buildings. So
yeah, but you don't know that I'm going to sell that whole campus to tenant and the value could drop because they could overperform, and then what are you going to do, right?
Well, maybe a tenant will pay the 3 cap.
Well, Robert, you have the, interesting deal on this panel. One of the unique cases where you're not buying an on-campus building with a ground lease and the health system relationship, but the dynamic in the neighborhood that you bought is occurring in many locations, urban growth, urban infill location, betting on the future demand from a shifting population, but you're adjacent to campus too, and you're anticipating a change. The building's good, solid as it is, but you're anticipating some evolution of the tenancy in the building. Going back, pulling back the theme of the ground lease and the relationship with the host hospital and health system, what do you do with that building today to pave the way for, future relationships with the adjacent hospital in your asset management role?
There's a lot to that question in there, and there's some specifics with this that are a bit unique just because the hospital itself is one that has gone through a couple different sales to a couple different people, and it's, we don't necessarily know what the long-term future is going to look like that. So in this situation, we do know this is the good demographics, and we kind of use our approach to say to everybody in the local market, here's what we can offer. We have relationships elsewhere in the market with other large players, and we like to use the approach of saying, here's what we can deliver. We do business over here. We've got a great location here that's going to serve X, Y, and Z demographics. And we think it gives you a lot of good access points. And here, you can consolidate your landlords because we know there's a small staff trying to do a lot of things, get to standard lease forms, get to standard terms where you don't have to constantly relook and say, geez, what was redlined and why was that changed and all that kind of stuff. So what we like to do in this situation is really broaden our relationships. Dignity's obviously in the local market. Providence is a local market. We do some stuff with Children's Hospital of LA, UCLA. There's a lot of other big health systems that we do work with on top of other just large national healthcare providers. So we use it really as an opportunity to showcase the location, the demographics, and provide that level of standardization and service that the providers can know and understand and hopefully attract them into that building.
Right. Kyle, you're a great representative of many investors who participate in this conference, and being a smaller and niche player, nimble, can be very focused on the client. You bought a portfolio, little microcosm of a CNL or so forth, but you're a small organization and you have a lot of different health systems here that are the hosts for your building. So, and you're dealing with a variety of structures and personalities. How, as a small shop, do you manage through those varying properties and relationships?
Well, I mean, for us, it's the only way you can, which is a lot of personal involvement. If you're in the business of investing in value-add medical office, and we would describe our strategy somewhat simply as buy it, fix it, lease it, sell it. So usually what we bring to an equation is a situation where a building that's part of the campus, which is still being used by the health system, but has had occupancy challenges, we look for things that you can correct, and that investment of capital sometimes is very welcome news because it's still real estate that they want. I presume you wouldn't ground lease stuff that you don't want to have in your portfolio. You want it back at some point and have opportunities to think about that over time. But, and every now and then you find situations where the buildings get into a dynamic, the self-defeating cycle of capital investment not occurring sort of leads to a further loss of occupancy, and it happens, to really well-capitalized firm, but that particular dynamic just doesn't make sense. But, there can be an opportunity for that partnership to create it and feel it, and we think, that's one of the opportunities that's there, but necessity for executing that is a lot of personal interaction with, people like Scott or Or, in many cases, it's the president of that hospital that becomes, pretty heavily involved in that because they live in that environment and feel it. If they're recruiting practices or acquiring practices, sometimes it's very difficult for them to successfully acquire a practice, but then take them over to the dumpy MOB on their campus and say, well, this is where you would go.
They don't have the money. They don't have the money in that capital plan of a system to say, I need $150 a square foot to put this orthopod in the building,
Right.
and he brings the money and makes it easier.
Right. And so, it seems to me that oftentimes it's a symbiotic thing that just occurs naturally. I think, like a lot of things in business, if you're a normal person, you're going to find that other people are normal and you'll get along well, and you each have your own side that you need to protect your own interests, but there is commonality, just as there is in a transaction, that you're all working towards something that you both want. And part of that is, you bring it to the table. In our case, we are a situation where we'll spend a shorter period of time than, say, a core owner would with a particular project, because ours is to transition it back into the hands of those owners or back into the hands of the health system if they want to be the buyer, and execute that strategy for us and what we're looking to do.
I'm going to give, I think, one last question. I'll give it to Russ.
Lucky me.
Well, the two of you, and actually I could pick on the two of you at the end because you both have extremely large medical office platforms, a large number of health system relationships. The C&L portfolio is 3.3 million square feet. It had overlap with existing relationships, new relationships. With each of these major acquisitions that you're doing, a lot of lessons learned and creating synergies across the platform and integration of that new square footage. Takeaways, lessons learned.
Yeah, I think there's an infinite number, but I'll keep it brief. I would say kind of lessons learned from our perspective. I think we underappreciated just the property management kind of transition lift. C&L used third-party property managers, and we predominantly manage our assets in-house. I think kind of initially in the portfolio, we probably expected that we would transition to well tower management quicker than we ultimately did, just because of the operational lift involved. And we've also been kind of pleasantly surprised with the quality and local knowledge of the property managers that C&L had engaged.
Or we carry on to that?
If you would like to
doing
add.
big portfolios, I think it's a similar answer. Is lesson learned is property management certainly makes a big difference. I think on the other side of it is we've really learned that becoming major in a market and having some sort of scale does allow us to do a lot more things. I think when we look at it, we might not have the specific flexibility, that Kyle has. He can come in and specifically focus on one asset, but when you now have the ability to focus on 30 assets and staff it and resource it and look at it kind of cohesively, I think we've now appreciated some of the benefits as you can understand the markets a lot more and spend a lot more in-depth time there. So I think that's the flip side of it.
Great. And Scott, because you're the health system guy, you're going to get the last word. And what do you really want out of your landlord partners?
So I will tell you, property management number one, right? That's like critical. But these ridiculous asset management tours that you guys do around the country, right? And you go touch and you walk into my office for 45 minutes. Those are actually important, right? Because we need to know when an issue comes up, whatever that issue is, that we can call you and we can talk to you. Now, if we say there's a cam rack problem, make sure that problem gets dealt with, right? But more importantly, we're even in real estate, right? But I've got 250 landlords. If it boils up to my office, I got to have somebody I can call that can get it done. And so the time that you're taking to go see your end users is important time. You got to listen to them, but you got to just remember, they're not in the real estate business every day. I'm in the real estate business every day, but with 250 properties, I can't touch those things every day. So it's important to not only start the relationship, but keep the relationship, even if it's just an annual thing, right? Keep that relationship. You know, Kevin shows up, right? That's important. And it's not so much to stroke our ego, it's just to make sure that our side of the people hadn't changed. If my right-hand person has changed, you need to know it.
Great pearls of wisdom. So I want to thank the panelists for interesting cases, inspiring tales, and good lessons learned. So thank you very much.
Madam Mayor, thank you for...
In fact, you wanted to hear my closing comments, so thank you. Thank you. It has nothing to do with the excellent panel, nor that your flight was scheduled late. So special round of applause to the Revista folks for putting this together before we take off. We will see you in February. Travel safe. Thank you.